Atheist's Wager. The Atheist's Wager, introduced by philosopher Michael Martin in his 1990 book Atheism, a philosophical justification, serves as a counter to Pascal's wager, which argues that belief in God is the safest bet. Instead, the Atheist's Wager posits that living a morally good life is the most rational choice, regardless of the existence of a deity. One interpretation of the wager considers the existence of a benevolent deity. If a kind and loving God exists, such a deity would likely reward individuals based on their good deeds rather than mere belief. Therefore, leading a virtuous life would result in divine reward, irrespective of one's faith. Another possibility is the absence of a deity. If no gods exist, living ethically still ensures a positive legacy and contributes to the betterment of society. Thus, moral actions have intrinsic value, independent of divine presence. A further perspective within the Atheist's Wager suggests that a sincere disbelief might be more commendable to a just deity than insincere belief. This implies that authenticity in one's convictions is crucial. One should not believe in a God purely out of fear or self-interest, but should instead follow reason and integrity. In essence, the Atheist's Wager advocates for a life led by ethical principles, proposing that such a path yields favorable outcomes whether or not a deity exists. Creator of God. The problem of the creator of God is a philosophical question that challenges the concept of a deity as the ultimate creator. It arises from the inquiry, if everything has a creator, then who created God? This question suggests that positing a divine creator leads to an infinite regress, where each creator would require its own creator. Perspectives, religious doctrines. Some traditions address this by proposing that the universe is eternal and uncreated, thereby eliminating the need for a creator. Others suggest that God is incomparable and beyond human understanding, rejecting the notion of God as a first cause. First cause argument. Proponents argue that God is the uncaused cause, existing outside the chain of causality and not subject to creation. Nature of time and existence. Some suggest that concepts of time and causality may not apply to a divine being, rendering the question of God's creation meaningless. This philosophical problem continues to be a topic of debate, exploring the nature of existence, causality, and the concept of a supreme creator.
Evil God Challenge. The Evil God Challenge is a philosophical thought experiment that questions why belief in an all-good, omnipotent God is more rational than belief in an all-evil, omnipotent deity. Proponents argue that traditional arguments for God's existence often do not specify moral attributes, making the concept of an evil God equally plausible. Critics, such as William Lane Craig, counter that the observable presence of good in the world contradicts the notion of an all-evil God, as such a being would not permit any goodness to exist. This challenge invites deeper examination of the assumptions underlying theistic beliefs and the moral characteristics attributed to a deity.
Fate of the unlearned. The fate of the unlearned addresses the eschatological question concerning the ultimate destiny of individuals who, having never been exposed to a particular theology or doctrine, lack the opportunity to accept or follow its teachings. This issue examines whether those unaware of specific divine revelations are subject to punishment for not adhering to requirements they were never informed of. Christian perspectives. Roman Catholicism. The Catholic Church teaches that while Jesus Christ attained salvation for all through his death, individuals must accept this salvation. However, the Church acknowledges that those ignorant of the gospel through no fault of their own, yet who seek truth and do God's will as they understand it, may achieve salvation. This inclusivity extends to unbaptized individuals who might have desired baptism had they known its necessity. Reformed Christianity. Debate exists regarding the unevangelized's fate. Some traditions emphasize God's sovereignty and suggest that divine mercy may extend to those who, without exposure to the gospel, live according to moral principles inscribed on their hearts. Anglicanism. The Church of England offers prayers entrusting all humanity to God's mercy, reflecting a hope that God's will is accomplished universally, even for those outside the Christian faith. Methodism. The United Methodist Church includes prayers for unbaptized children and those who did not profess the Christian faith, entrusting them to God's unfailing love and mercy. Christian Universalism. This theological perspective posits that all individuals will ultimately be reconciled to God, suggesting that divine love and mercy encompass everyone, regardless of their knowledge of or response to the gospel during their earthly lives. Islamic perspective. In Islam, the fate of those unacquainted with the message of Islam is a subject of theological discussion. Some Islamic scholars propose that such individuals will be tested in the afterlife, with their eternal destiny contingent upon their performance in this trial. Other positions. Buddhism. Buddhism posits that all beings, regardless of their exposure to Buddhist teachings, continue through cycles of rebirth until they achieve enlightenment, nirvana. The path to enlightenment is accessible to all, though awareness and practice of Buddhist principles facilitate progress toward this goal. The question of the fate of the unlearned remains a complex and nuanced topic within various religious traditions, reflecting broader themes of divine justice, mercy, and the inclusivity of salvation. Free will. The argument from free will, also known as the paradox of free will or theological fatalism, contends that the existence of an omniscient deity is incompatible with human free will. The core of this argument is that if a deity possesses complete foreknowledge of all events, then human actions must align with this predetermined knowledge, thereby challenging the notion of true free will. Key points: omniscience versus free will. If a deity knows all future actions, individuals cannot act otherwise than what is foreknown, suggesting that free will is an illusion. Theological implications. This argument raises questions about doctrines like predestination and divine foreknowledge, examining how they align with the concept of human autonomy. In response, some theologians and philosophers propose that divine foreknowledge does not necessitate predestination, suggesting that knowing an action in advance doesn't cause it to happen. Others argue for compatibilism, the idea that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive. This debate remains a central topic in discussions about the nature of divinity and human freedom. God of the gaps. The God of the gaps is a theological concept suggesting that gaps in scientific knowledge are evidence of God's existence. As scientific understanding advances, these gaps diminish, potentially reducing the need to invoke divine explanations. Critics argue that relying on this approach can hinder scientific progress and that attributing unknown phenomena to divine intervention may discourage further inquiry. Proponents of theistic evolution and other perspectives advocate for a harmonious relationship between science and faith, suggesting that divine action operates through natural processes rather than in the gaps of scientific knowledge. Hitchens's razor. Hitchens's razor is an epistemological principle articulated by author and journalist Christopher Hitchens. It asserts that claims made without supporting evidence can be dismissed without evidence. This principle emphasizes that the burden of proof lies with those who make assertions. If they fail to provide evidence, their claims can be rejected without further argument. Hitchens employed this razor particularly in discussions about religious beliefs, challenging assertions made without empirical support. The term Hitchens's razor gained popularity after his death in 2011, notably through the efforts of evolutionary biologist and atheist activist Jerry Coyne. It is often discussed alongside the Sagan standard, which states that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Incompatible properties. The incompatible properties argument posits that certain attributes traditionally ascribed to God are logically inconsistent with each other, rendering the concept of such a deity incoherent. This argument examines how combining specific divine qualities leads to contradictions or paradoxes. Key examples: evil versus good and omnipotence. The problem of evil argues that the existence of evil is incompatible with the concept of an omnipotent and perfectly good God. A good God is incompatible with some possible worlds, thus incapable of creating them without losing the property of being a totally good God. Purpose versus timelessness. This argument suggests that possessing a purpose implies a direction toward a future state, which requires a temporal framework. A being existing outside of time would lack the temporal context necessary to have a purpose, leading to an incompatibility between timelessness and purposeful action. Omniscience versus indeterminacy or free will. The argument from free will contends that omniscience and free will are incompatible. If a deity knows all future actions, individuals cannot act otherwise than what is foreknown, suggesting that free will is an illusion. These examples illustrate how combining certain divine attributes can lead to logical contradictions, challenging the coherence of the traditional conception of God. Inconsistent revelation. The argument from inconsistent revelations contends that the existence of multiple, conflicting religious revelations undermines the credibility of any single religious truth claim. This argument suggests that if different religions assert exclusive access to divine truths, yet their teachings contradict each other, it casts doubt on the validity of all such claims. Key points: contradictory teachings. Various religions present differing doctrines, rituals, and beliefs, many of which are mutually exclusive. For example, differing views on the nature of God, salvation, and morality can be found across religious traditions. Implications for truth claims. The presence of these inconsistencies challenges the notion that any one religion possesses the complete and exclusive truth. If multiple religions claim exclusive access to divine revelation but offer contradictory teachings, it raises questions about the authenticity of these revelations. Philosophical considerations. This argument is often discussed in the context of religious pluralism, which acknowledges the diversity of religious beliefs and practices worldwide. It prompts a re-evaluation of the concept of absolute religious truth and encourages dialogue and understanding among different faiths. In summary, the argument from inconsistent revelations highlights the challenges posed by religious diversity to the claims of exclusive religious truths, advocating for a more nuanced understanding of religious beliefs in a pluralistic world. Non-belief. The argument from non-belief posits that the existence of widespread non-belief in God is inconsistent with the concept of an omnipotent, omnibenevolent deity. It suggests that if such a God existed and desired all humans to recognize and worship him, the prevalence of non-belief would be unlikely. Key points. Divine desire for belief. If God is perfectly loving and omnipotent, he would have the desire and capability to ensure that all reasonable individuals come to believe in him. Existence of non-believers. The presence of reasonable non-believers, those who are not aware of or do not accept theistic claims, implies that either God does not exist or does not have the desire to make his existence known to all. Implications for theism. This argument challenges theistic claims by highlighting the inconsistency between the existence of non-belief and the attributes traditionally ascribed to God. Philosopher J. L. Schellenberg has notably advanced this argument, suggesting that a perfectly loving God would not permit non-resistant non-belief. The argument from non-belief is part of a broader discourse on divine hiddenness and the problem of evil, which examines the compatibility of God's existence with the presence of evil and non-belief in the world. Critics of the argument may propose that God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing non-belief, such as preserving human free will or the potential for soul-making. However, the argument from non-belief remains a significant point of discussion in philosophical and theological debates regarding the nature of God and the existence of evil. Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a principle that suggests when presented with competing hypotheses, the one with the fewest assumptions should be preferred. In the context of religion, this principle is often invoked to argue that the simplest explanation, typically one that does not involve supernatural entities, is more likely to be correct. Application in religious contexts. Theistic claims. Occam's razor is used to question the necessity of invoking a deity to explain natural phenomena. The argument posits that natural explanations, which do not require the assumption of a supernatural being, are preferable. For instance, the existence of evil and suffering is reconciled with the assumption that no God exists. Miracles. When evaluating claims of miracles, Occam's razor suggests that natural explanations are more plausible than supernatural ones. If a natural cause can account for an event, invoking a divine cause is unnecessary. Religious pluralism. The principle is also applied to the argument from inconsistent revelations, which contends that the existence of multiple, conflicting religious revelations undermines the credibility of any single religious truth claim. Occam's razor suggests that the simplest explanation, one that does not assume the truth of any particular religious claim, is more plausible. It's important to note that while Occam's razor advocates for simplicity, it does not necessarily prove that the simplest explanation is correct. It merely suggests that, all else being equal, simpler explanations are preferable. Omnipotence paradox. The omnipotence paradox is a philosophical problem that questions the coherence of the concept of omnipotence, which is traditionally ascribed to God in many religious traditions. It arises when attempting to understand the limits of divine power and whether the concept of being all-powerful is logically consistent. Key aspects of the paradox. Contradictory actions. One of the main challenges is the question of whether omnipotence includes the ability to do logically impossible things. A common example is the question, can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that even it cannot lift it? If the answer is yes, then the being is limited in its ability to lift the stone, contradicting the idea of omnipotence. If the answer is no, then there is something the being cannot do, again challenging the notion of being all-powerful. Logical constraints. The paradox points out that omnipotence might not involve the ability to perform logically incoherent or self-contradictory actions. For instance, the idea of creating a square circle or a married bachelor is nonsensical, and no being, regardless of its power, can perform logical contradictions. Philosophical responses. Some philosophers argue that omnipotence should not be understood as the power to do the logically impossible. Rather, It is the ability to do anything that is logically possible, and logical contradictions are not things that can be done, but rather nonsensical concepts. From this perspective, omnipotence doesn't mean having the ability to perform logically absurd actions. Others suggest that omnipotence is compatible with certain limits because these limits arise from the very nature of power and logic, which are inherently coherent with the concept of an omnipotent being. Theological implications. The omnipotence paradox is often discussed in theology and philosophy of religion. The paradox suggests that a truly omnipotent deity might not be able to perform logically contradictory tasks, but it doesn't necessarily reduce their power in any meaningful way. Some theologians argue that omnipotence pertains only to the power to do everything that is possible in a meaningful sense. Conclusion: the omnipotence paradox does not necessarily refute the idea of an omnipotent being, but it challenges the way in which omnipotence is traditionally understood. It pushes for a more nuanced understanding of divine power, focusing on the idea that logical coherence may be a boundary even for the all-powerful. Poor design. The argument from poor design, also known as the dysteleological argument, challenges the existence of an omnipotent and omnibenevolent creator by highlighting perceived suboptimal designs in nature. It posits that a perfect deity would not create organisms exhibiting inefficient or flawed features. Key points: suboptimal designs. Examples include the human appendix, which can become inflamed and cause health issues, and the recurrent laryngeal nerve in giraffes, which follows a circuitous route, suggesting inefficiency. The light-sensing cells in the eye face backward, away from the light they are supposed to detect. Additionally, all vertebrates breathe and ingest food through the same opening. Implications for theism. These observations suggest that if such a deity existed, the natural world would exhibit optimal designs, challenging the notion of a perfect creator. This argument is part of a broader discourse on the problem of evil and theodicy, which examines the compatibility of a benevolent deity with the existence of suffering and imperfection in the world. Critics of the argument may propose that what appears as poor design is actually the result of natural processes like evolution, which operates through mechanisms such as natural selection and genetic drift, leading to suboptimal outcomes. In summary, the argument from poor design questions the existence of a perfect creator by pointing to inefficiencies and flaws in natural organisms, suggesting that such imperfections are inconsistent with the attributes of an omnipotent and benevolent deity.
Problem of evil. The problem of evil is a central issue in the philosophy of religion that questions how to reconcile the existence of evil and suffering with an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient God. This dilemma challenges the coherence of such a deity's existence given the presence of evil in the world. Key aspects: logical problem of evil. This argument asserts that the simultaneous existence of evil and an all-powerful, all-good God is logically contradictory. If God is willing to prevent evil but not able, he is not omnipotent. If able but not willing, he is malevolent. If both able and willing, then why does evil exist? Evidential problem of evil. This perspective suggests that while the existence of evil doesn't logically disprove God, the sheer amount and severity of evil make it improbable that an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God exists. Responses to the problem. Theodicies. These are justifications for God's allowance of evil, aiming to demonstrate that the existence of evil is compatible with a benevolent deity. Free will defense. This argument posits that God grants humans free will, and the existence of evil results from human misuse of this freedom, not from God's will. Soul-making theodicy. Proposed by philosopher John Hick, this theodicy suggests that experiencing and overcoming evil is necessary for spiritual development and growth. The problem of evil remains a profound and enduring topic in theological and philosophical discussions, prompting various interpretations and responses across different belief systems. Problem of hell. The problem of hell is an ethical and theological issue prevalent in Abrahamic religions, particularly Christianity and Islam. It questions how the existence of hell, a place of eternal punishment, can be reconciled with a belief in a just, moral, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient God. Critics argue that condemning souls to eternal torment is inconsistent with the notion of a loving and all-powerful deity. Key issues: justice and eternal punishment. The concept of eternal damnation raises questions about divine justice. Punishing finite human sins with infinite suffering appears disproportionate, challenging the idea of a fair and merciful God. Free will and divine attributes. The coexistence of human free will with God's omniscience and omnipotence presents a paradox. If God is all-knowing and all-powerful, he would foresee and have control over human actions, including sinful behavior, leading to questions about human responsibility and the justification for eternal punishment. Proposed resolutions: free will defense. Some theologians argue that hell is a consequence of human free will. God grants individuals the freedom to choose, and those who willingly reject Him consign themselves to separation from the divine presence. Annihilationism. This perspective suggests that souls not granted salvation are not subjected to eternal torment but are instead annihilated or cease to exist, aligning the concept of divine justice with the finality of punishment. Universal reconciliation. Another view posits that all souls will eventually be reconciled with God, implying that hell serves as a temporary state for purification rather than eternal damnation. The problem of hell continues to be a subject of intense debate among theologians and philosophers, prompting diverse interpretations and doctrines within various religious traditions. Russell's teapot. Russell's teapot is an analogy proposed by the British philosopher Bertrand Russell to illustrate that the burden of proof lies on the person making an unfalsifiable claim, rather than on others to disprove it. This analogy is often used in discussions about religious belief and skepticism, particularly in debates about the existence of God. The analogy in a 1952 article titled, "Is There a God?" Russell described a hypothetical scenario in which he claims that a tiny china teapot is orbiting the Sun somewhere between Earth and Mars. However, the teapot is too small to be detected by telescopes. Because of its undetectability, no one can disprove its existence. Despite this, Russell argued that it would be unreasonable to expect people to believe in the teapot just because they cannot prove it doesn't exist. Key points and implications. Burden of proof. The analogy highlights that when someone makes a claim, such as the existence of God, they must provide evidence to support it. The burden of proof does not fall on skeptics to disprove the claim. Skepticism and falsifiability. Russell's argument aligns with scientific and philosophical skepticism, where claims should be testable and falsifiable. If a claim cannot be proven false, like an undetectable teapot in space, that does not mean it is true. Critique of religious belief. The analogy is often used to criticize faith-based beliefs, arguing that religious claims should not be accepted without evidence, just as one would not believe in the teapot without proof. Relation to atheism and agnosticism. Russell's teapot is frequently cited in debates about atheism, reinforcing the idea that disbelief in God is justified if no evidence is provided. It also supports an agnostic stance, where one withholds belief until sufficient proof is presented. Later uses and expansions. The teapot analogy has inspired similar thought experiments, such as Carl Sagan's Dragon in My Garage, which examines belief in the supernatural through a similar lens. It has also influenced Richard Dawkins' discussions on religious belief, particularly in The God Delusion, where he applies the teapot argument to challenge religious doctrines. Criticism and counterarguments. Some theists argue that God is fundamentally different from a teapot because religious belief is based on personal experiences, historical texts, and philosophical arguments, rather than being a random, unverifiable claim. Others suggest that scientific evidence is not the only path to knowledge, and that religious or metaphysical beliefs can be justified through other means. Conclusion: Russell's teapot remains a powerful tool in debates about belief, skepticism, and the burden of proof. It continues to be referenced in philosophy, atheism, and discussions on rational thought, challenging claims that rely on faith without empirical evidence.